Yeah, they weren't there, and then they popped up. Kyla's on 6. Run it, run it. Oh my God. They're not on.
No, I didn't hand out this microphone.
Okay, cool. Can we run to them? Stand by. You want me to run them out?
Yep, I got it.
This is on the floor.
There you go. So maybe next time I'll go back to doing microphones instead of her.
All right, these work. Oh, exciting. Great. So we have a lot. Okay, this panel is kind of insane because there's been so much discussion this week alone on open models. What is an open model, right? What is open AI? Not that one, like open AI. So let's start at maybe the definition, right? Which is also hard because there are so many definitions out there. But there's the newest one, and the one with maybe the most consensus right now, maybe, is one from the Open Source Initiative, right, which is kind of the steward of all open source things, including software. So, Ollie, it's kind of something you've been following closely. I guess you have to. So I was hoping you could explain this definition and at a high level and tell us what this like official definition of OpenAI means for the industry.
Absolutely. I think when it gets with openness and AI, openness is an overloaded term these days. We have a whole spectrum of models of varying kinds, from models that are behind APIs, oftentimes referred to as closed models, models that are trained behind closed doors on closed data, but the weights are available, open weights models, and the set of models that we call truly open models, models where you actually have access to the whole stack, including the pre-training data, the code that was used to crawl that data, the code that was used to pre-process that data, the tokenization, the algorithms, the checkpoints, all the evaluations, all the benchmarks, all together. So, it's a very crowded space. I think that should actually speak to the value of openness. The fact that we actually have open washing quite active in this space suggests that we all are realizing that the momentum behind open AI is actually catching up. Open models are actually getting very, very, very close to the closed ones. And it's just a phenomenal space to watch. But because of this crowdedness in the space, I think there was a need for sort of what does open mean at the end of the day. And I think OSI took a step in that direction. I believe it's a right step in the right direction. When you talk about open source, there is basically the how of it and the right of it. So do I have the right to use it, and do I have the right to use what, under what conditions, and then the how of it, like what do I have access to. And I think the OSI definition is the right definition in the right space, but it's not there yet in my opinion. So OSI defines it at a high level as you need to have some visibility to training data, you need to have the code, the training code released, and you have to have the model released. And obviously the licensing should be appropriately adjusted. To us, it's there, but it's not just right there. And the biggest problem that we have is that under the OSI definition, current definitions, the pre-training data, the way that it's worded, says that it needs to provide sufficient information for a skilled person to be able to reproduce. And that is just not enough in terms of data availability or data access, because there might be enough information that says you need to pay me $20 million for your data, or I have to spend a lot of energy and momentum to be able to reproduce that. And that's not the spirit. To us, the spirit of openness, and that's sort of what gets us excited, is the ability to be able to understand what you've done, to be able to build upon it, but I need to understand it to the level that I could actually build upon it. And I need to have the ability to fork from it, not the end product. I might actually need to fork in the middle of the way. I might be able to actually modify what you have done early in the pipeline to be able to achieve what I want. And for the spirit of that, I think the definition on data is actually lacking a little bit of a clarity. There are more technical details. For example, if you use another closed model to generate data and use that data openly to train, is that open or closed? I think a little bit more clarity on those elements would be useful. When you get to a space of multimodal models, it gets a little trickier because now you have to have an image encoder. And now if I use an image encoder that's open weight but not open data, do I make my full system, which is much bigger than an image encoder, open source or not? What if I use that image encoder as an initialization and backpropagate through it? And now I'm changing all of those weights with my open data. Is that open or not? And these are sort of details that probably needs more clarity on, but I believe OSI definition is the right step in the right direction.
Irene, do you have thoughts on the definition? Do you agree with it, disagree?
I have so many thoughts. I constantly have thoughts. Words are hard. Tech is hard. This microphone blip was absolutely planned to show you how hard tech is. But
Right.
words are helpful. And just the guidance around the open source initiatives definition that came out this week is really great to give intentionality to when we're talking about a system. Often there's a lot of model fixation and there's a lot of weight given to weights. And for example, AI2 has been really thoughtful about sharing resources, about resources that are adjacent to systems like evaluations. On Hugging Face, we see incredible growth on the dataset side, so especially for OSI to give attention to datasets is really powerful. A lot of just like the boring part of being in tech is when you think about what should be made accessible and what's helpful to people, data set work is often not glamorized. Even though it's so powerful and the data quality you've seen, it actually improves model performance. We've seen, for example, fine web and synthetic data. So we acquired Argia AI a few moons ago. I don't know how time works. And it's been incredible to see how helpful, even it's like kind of behind the scenes, all of this data intentionality is. That being said, open weight, and I hope that we can move towards consensus on wording, maybe not open source, but open weight models are really helpful for the community. We've seen, for example, Llama just have thousands of variations as soon as a new model family is released on Hugging Face.
Right, for sure. Now, we were supposed to have a third panelist, but they pulled out yesterday. It was Meta, and that would have been nice because Meta has been very active in this space, right? Once upon a time, they were calling their Llama models, which are insanely popular, open source models. Now they sometimes call them that. Sometimes they call them something else. They released a statement on Monday kind of vociferously disagreeing with the OSI and saying, they respect their work, but not the definition. So you were making the point earlier, a second ago, Ollie, that there's a lot of open washing going on, right? So why does it matter that we have kind of a commonly understood definition? Why is it important that we have an accepted definition? Does it matter for regulation, for example? There are technological concerns as well, right?
Yeah, these definitions eventually connect to regulations, connect to communities, and connects to mainstream works. So I think what OSI is doing on sort of trying to develop a consensus, at least among a subgroup of these communities, is actually very valid, valuable work. I think early on, even if you think about the history of open software, early on in the 90s, there were actually heated conversations about what is open source software, what is free software, what is open source software. And all of those discussions and conversations actually, I think, was essential, excuse me, is essential in helping us develop a better understanding of what open source software means over time. And now we're in that phase with AI open source. So it's going to take us a while to understand what it means to be open source, what do we need to actually sort of implement. But the minute that these things tie to action and legislation, we need to be careful about what is called open source and what is not called open source. And to me, the spirit of open source is me being able to build on top of your work, being able to fork from it. And anything that I could actually fork from in the middle, in the beginning, at the end, empowers me to be able to do that and gives me the right to do that. That's open source. And short of that, I think these are great work. It's just not open source.
Right, yeah. I mean, I remember earlier this summer, too, right? XAI, Elon Musk's AI company, which seems to be growing at a crazy pace in terms of the funding it's raising. released or open sourced Grok, right, their flagship model, but without the training code. They called it an open source release, but was it really, could people really use it in the way that they should be able to? So there seems to be, yeah, to your point, like a lot of confusion, among the developer community. It's like, what does this mean? What can I do with this? Like, what are the licenses I have to be aware of? That being said, I did want to touch on in this panel some of the advantages of maybe not open source, quote unquote, AI, because that's very confusing, but open forms of AI. So what would both of you say, being in the space, helping to produce models, producing your own models that are open, what would you say are some of the reasons that, those are just objectively good things? What can people do with these open models?
So I want to touch on something that Ali said earlier around the word openness. And it's been interesting to see how different communities use the word openness. I often frame AI in three ways: as a science, as a product, and as a security threat. And there are many different communities that view it in different ways. Often the open source community has a lot of internal tensions. I used to think that's not what a community is, and then I spent time with my family. That's 100% what a community is. A lot of infighting. It is what it is. But when you view AI as a science, there's these aspects of reproducibility that are really helpful. And then there's this question of how accessible is this model? So some of the most popular models on Hugging Face are actually the relatively small ones and the ones that are quite cheap and easy to run. So these quantized or relatively compressed models we've seen from the Llama family. But one of the most popular ones is GPT-2. It's more accessible to researchers. It's not dollar bills to run. And it helps people do their research and do this type of science. So these kinds of small models I'm really excited about, but this is a question of, does it actually fit your use case, or is it more generalizable in the way that you want it to be?
Couldn't agree more. I think the space of making things accessible also touches upon the diversity, our understanding, and also the science part of it. Going back to your question, I think there is, again, at least the future that I expect to see is going to be a future where we have a whole spectrum of models out there. Models with different capabilities, models with different degrees of openness, models with different degrees of licenses around them. And I don't believe that. I don't believe in a future where there's going to be a small number of models. And I think just look up on Hugging Face. The space is the number of models that are exploding exponentially. I think that would only explode even more in that space. We're going to have a whole gamut of models, and people pick and choose what they want based on what they want to do. If you're touching a sensitive topic or you're making decisions on regulated industries, obviously using a closed model would be questionable. So there's going to be basically trusted use cases that would probably gravitate more towards open models. There's going to be applications and apps and wrappers around models, and they just pick and choose whatever they want.
Right, yeah. And I think we already see that, right? I mean, like there's no shortage of AI apps out there. Yeah, just AI apps. I mean, everything is AI now, everything. In part because of open models, and it's so easy to use one that's out there and fine-tune it for your needs, right? But I have to, because we don't have a representative from the closed side on stage, I have to ask some questions that they might, if they were here, or raise. Some topics they might raise. So what about the security of open models, right? Some might say that open models, because you can't necessarily put in the same guardrails and filters and take the same moderation measures, open models are less safe, right, quote unquote, than a closed model that you might get through an API and no other way. So what would both of you say to that? Do you think that's a valid point? Is it a valid point in certain circumstances? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think let me address this pre-baked notion that closed and safe are synonyms. They're not. And I just wanted to put it out there. I'm sure if we asked within this room, not too long ago, many of us missed flights, got stuck in airports, or couldn't have care for our patients in hospitals because a very, very closed system just had vulnerability. So I think safe and closed are not synonyms. Now, a technology can be misused, and I think we all agree on, we've seen examples of that, and AI as a new technology is not an exception of that. Assuming that, we have a choice to live in two different worlds. The first world, where a misuse happens, and we are at the mercy of few institutes, where their mission might not be aligned with humanity. Or we're living in a world in which we have millions of practitioners who know how to fix this problem, who can jump on the problem and fix it immediately. And looking back at history, I think almost 2 decades ago, maybe even longer, there were conversations about operating systems and very, very same phenomena. The open one, the closed one, which one is safer. Fast forward, we're using the open one in the most critical places, in nuclear reactors, in hospitals, in airplanes. So there is actually this notion that by opening up, you're actually educating a whole community, an army of experts who could jump on this problem and solve the problem. And I'd rather live in that world where if something bad happens, we actually have the ability to just jump on the problem and solve the problem.
I completely agree, and it's just nuance is really hard in such a loaded field. I wrote this paper last year on the gradient of release, viewing how we open or release systems as a gradient, as a spectrum, and the kind of tensions at either end where there's this cybersecurity argument. When you're more open, you're able to reach more people who can see these kinds of vulnerabilities. But to move, I found it's like quite ideological on how people think about what's safer. And to move past that ideology, I think in 2 points. One on the kind of accessibility and what is hosted. And the other one I'm forgetting because it's very bright on here, but it'll come back to me. So on the hosted, I had my voice cloned non-consensually in March of this year. It was not malicious, but it's a very weird feeling. I didn't like it. And this was through a closed wait, but accessible through a free trial. This is the kind of user interface that enables lay people to be able to generate voice clones. Kind of scary. So this is the nuance, and maybe it's accessible to people, but not open weight. There are some barriers to be able to run open weight models, which just means kind of monitoring is really hard. Monitoring at scale, when you get millions of users, unless you just want so many false positives, it's really hard to meaningfully monitor everything. And sorry to trigger everybody about this election cycle. I used to work on election cybersecurity, and we were trying to monitor for that. What do you flag as election? Is it the word woman? It's so much can be flagged as potentially misuse. I remember the second point, which is how do we threat model? And it's important to view this by system and application. So often we treat these generative systems all the same, but the kinds of fears that I have around misuse by modality are really different. So I have a more visceral reaction to voice than I do of somebody writing text that said Irene said something, or to video as opposed to image. And I think that's a really important part for how do we think about misuse.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it's tough, right? I mean, I'm not going to lie. I wrestle with some of these things myself, the safety of open models and is that better, is it easier to safeguard a closed one versus not? There are many benefits in having an open one, of course, for transparency and explainability, and of course you want to be able to look into a system and understand how it works. But my mind, it keeps going back to things like, the image generator on X, for example, right? That's an open model that's maybe being used in a questionable way, has no guardrails, right? Has already been used to generate election disinformation and all sorts of copyrighted, objectionable material. And then you have things like Stability AI's models too, right? Where those have been fine-tuned for kind of questionable, nefarious purposes, right? Not to villainize, creators of open models and systems, but you look at that and you're like, wow, this is like evil doing on a mass scale, right? And did like an open model, by nature of being open, sort of enable that?
To me, I think part of the problem actually goes back to the science of this. I think this is probably the first time in the history that we're deploying models at such unprecedented rates with such a shallow understanding of what we're deploying. We as a whole community, we don't fully understand these systems. We don't know how to build the next control over these systems. We don't have a parametric way of controlling the output of these systems. And to me, we're having all of these conversations because the technology stack is just not ready yet. And the science is missing, the technology part is missing, the innovation is missing. And again, I want to tie it back again to the openness, because AI was born and raised in the open, right? We build one building block after the other building block after the other building block. I build on top of yours, you build on top of mine, and that's how it progressed. And the best, most effective tool that I know of that could actually address that innovation gap, that technology gap, is openness. Open communal approach to the research, opening up what you're doing, share your learning, so you could actually, I could use it on top of your learning to build on top of it, and vice versa. So I think it goes back all the way to that there is a gap. We need to just understand that there is a gap on these technology stacks, and we just all need to work on closing those gaps.
And also, just like this is the part of working in a company, there are just some boring things. A lot of things that we take down is more legal stuff and kind of copyright, and that completely makes sense that we don't want to share personal and identifiable information or medical data. There are some reasons that you wouldn't share some information. One of the hard parts to grapple with really icky things, and as a terminally online person, people on the internet do really weird, gross things, and they collect gross, weird things. But sometimes it's really helpful just to know that that's happening. And this is part of stability, is that with this image and multimodal data sets, I deeply, deeply respect the people who are doing that data work. It's really hard work to do. It's different than text. And at least we know what's in there. At least we can address it. It's part of the science of it.
True. Yeah. I mean, to your point, OpenAI, for example, allows you to remove images from their future training data sets, but we don't know for sure if they're doing that, right? There's no way to tell. I've asked them before, and they haven't really said anything of substance. So, yeah, we touched on regulation earlier, and I want to return to that if we can, if we have the time. I hope so. The AI Act in the EU already has a carve-out for open source, quote unquote, AI. And I wonder if you expect to see that in other regulation, assuming it gets passed. It seems to be a tough thing to do. And then, as a follow-on to that, do you think should open source, quote unquote, AI get different treatment from closed AI, and why?
My day job is a lot of policy work, so I think about this constantly, and there's been a lot of different flavors to how regulation is approached. I think there's some lessons that, for example, the EU is taking from open source software around liability for independent developers, and this is one of the issues of how can hobbyists, how can really talented people who don't have all of the power of an institution, of a tech company behind them, be able to, there's like this kind of meme of the internet is held up with popsicle sticks and bubble gum, and often just like this one dude, sorry to use a gendered term, it's usually like a dude with just like spare time, just keep an infrastructure running. And that kind of protection is really helpful for those type of people. I think that regulation is likely going to differ regionally, and it should. One of the reasons that it's important to think about systems and not just models is to recognize that different actors are likely responsible for different parts of this so-called value chain. So sometimes the folks that are collating data sets might be different than the people training the model, and the types of responsibility and the types of liability that comes with making that component of a system more open, I think should be conscious of the type of compliance that's needed.
There are a few things I would add to what Irene said. First of all, I want all of us, I know that we are all frustrated for lack of policy, lack of regulation, but I want all of us to also acknowledge it's a hard problem. The technology is actually moving at a pace that we technologists cannot keep up with just learning about what's coming out. Now, for regulators, for policymakers, it's a hard problem. Their whole space is changing constantly under their foot. But also, there are some hard problems. So, first of all, it's a hard, challenging problem, and we all need to acknowledge that. Second of all, is sort of I often say that a wrong policy would be way worse than lack of one. So I would also encourage policymakers, decision makers to take their time to understand these technologies before, and not to be deviated or fooled by the hype before they make a decision. And at Ai2, we spend a fair amount of time actually just educating decision makers on those phenomena. The last piece I add here is, to me, this ties back to the open source definition. To me, because of the lack of innovation, because of innovation that is desperately needed to take these technologies to the next level, we actually have to also find a way to carve out safe harbors. There should be a way for developers, especially the ones developing open source technologies, to be able to test things, to be able to try things, to be able to understand the effect of these things. The most important element of these models is data. That's where actually the juice is. And without actually sort of having access to it, being able to understand input-output relationships, we're just missing a global understanding of what these systems are doing. And without a safe harbor solution around these regulations, I think we're going to cripple the ability of the whole community to understand these systems, to be able to develop safe solutions so we actually get to the safety that we want. And I want to make sure that we're pushing for this to be able to carve out safe harbors around this.
Completely agree. One more point. I want to just not fixate on this kind of one-size-fits-all regulation, because even for the carve-out in the EU, you still have to comply with GDPR, and there are layers of regulation that's really helpful. So privacy regulation really helps protect against deepfakes, maybe one day in the US, and this is where the states are starting to build that kind of infrastructure. There's many ways that even sectorally, I'm a big believer in sectoral, and how harms are actualized through models are often through application. And so there should be a lot more scrutiny on these high-risk sectors like medicine.
Right, for sure. And if you want to hear about more about AI governance, we have a panel later today, so please come to that. Not to pitch another panel. Well, I'm moderating one. So with the time remaining, which isn't a lot, unfortunately, I wanted to end on a sort of upbeat, optimistic note, because it's tough to do when you're talking about AI these days, I think. What does the future of open AI hold? That's hard to say without confusing people. So many models are coming out, right? It's getting cheaper, it seems, to train them, certainly run them. So what makes you both excited about the future of open AI, and I guess the various forms it'll take and how people are going to use it to build things and just use it as end users too?
So I'm an AI researcher by training, so by default I'm actually overly optimistic about AI. I do believe that we're going to see more of AI coming out of the standard domains that we use to practice them, text and images and the like, going to the places that's going to actually affect our lives in a meaningful way. I'm all excited about that, and I'm all excited about the role that open plays, because I cannot grab a model off of the web and fine-tune it for neuro data, for cell data. These are like completely different domains, different architectures, different way of training them. I do believe that these new technologies are extremely powerful, and I do believe that they will change the way we do science discovery, drug discovery, medication, cure, the way we think about a planet. And I do believe that AI would have a role to play in all of those things, not being the solution, but would be a big part of the solution. And that's what we're striving for.
Something that's been really giving me joy is how much interdisciplinary work is starting to happen in this field. Interdisciplinary work is notoriously really difficult, but with this level of interest, one of the biggest AI conferences, Nuance, in December this year, is oversubscribed. And it's not just that Taylor Swift is going to be in Vancouver at the same time. There's just a lot, which is a whole different thing, but there's just a lot of energy in contributing to systems and the type of work that researchers can build on. So with Ai2's Olmo and Dolma getting best papers and people being able to build off of that, I hear a lot of grad student researchers get to use and appreciate Hugging Face. I always love hearing that. So seeing so much work happening across fields is really heartening, and just the kinds of tooling, not just on smaller, more accessible models, but for example, Hugging Face launched zero configuration inference last week, and that just makes being able to run models easier for folks. It just lowers that barrier, and I expect to see more attention being given to this type of tooling as opposed to maybe just like a marginal improvement in a large model performance.
Right, and that's a good place to end it. So thank you both for joining us, and to everyone else, have a great Disrupt. Thanks.